and a very special welcome to my Form 3s. This session is specifically focusing on introducing you to the concept of angles of elevation and depression. So here's what we're going to be covering in this session. Pay close attention to how we identify an angle of elevation, depression, and how we distinguish between these two types of angles. Now let's begin our session by first of all identifying scenarios where angles of elevation and depression occur to us naturally. First of all, on a daily basis, we may be looking at objects in and around our environment. Sometimes we may look up, we may look down, but most commonly our line of sight is naturally directly in front of us. Whenever we talk about angles of elevation and depression, as you will see in our illustrations coming up, angles of elevation and depression always form around a line of sight which is horizontal. Sometimes we will look up at objects above us and look down at objects below us. Now, if we had to identify when the angle of elevation forms versus when the angle of depression forms, the first thing we need to know is where is our line of sight. Naturally, our line of sight will always be parallel to the ground. That said, that means our line of sight is always going to be a horizontal line. When we talk about our natural line of sight, think about when you're standing upright. Where do you normally see? What can you see? How far can you see? You know that you normally can see what's directly in front of you. Hardly ever you can see what's above you or what's below you. This is your natural line of sight. Always when we are referring to angles of elevation and angles of depression, we're referring to those angles formed relative to our natural line of sight. Now let's get into talking about our angles of elevation. Now when we talk about an angle of elevation, we're talking about those angles which naturally form by looking up. Have you ever been out for a stroll on a nice cool day, looking up at the sky, observing the clouds as they float on by? Well, naturally, you'd be looking straight ahead. But the minute you adjust your line of sight to look up, you form a different angle. This angle which forms between your natural line of sight and your adjusted line of sight is called an angle of elevation. Notice here on the diagram, it's highlighted in yellow. Now, angles of depression, when do they form? Have you ever been walking around randomly in your house and somehow or the other managed to hit your toe on some piece of furniture? And then you start fretting and say, maybe I should have looked down instead. Well, if you did look down, you would have formed an angle of depression. Sometimes we need to be a little extra observant of where we're walking. Who knows, we might be able to prevent ourselves from damaging our little toes, or maybe we might stumble across something quite valuable. Have you ever been lucky enough to find a coin just lying around randomly? Now, as we've come to the end of this session, let's quickly wrap up by summarizing what we've learned thus far. When we talk about angles of elevation and depression, we must know that these form relative to a horizontal line, this horizontal line being our natural line of sight. When we talk about angles of elevation, they form above our natural line of sight. When we talk about angles of depression, we're speaking about those angles which form below our natural line of sight. Do you think you can distinguish between an angle of elevation versus an angle of depression? If you can distinguish between an angle of elevation and an angle of depression, you can look forward to our next two sessions. We'll be focusing on solving problems with angles of elevation and depression involved. I hope you remember your trigonometry and you know how to use your calculator well, as these skills are going to help you through solving these problems.